All right. We are live with David Page. Hello, Mr. Page.
Hello, sir. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on. I think this is the part where I'm supposed to say subscribe to the podcast, but we'll just say that now and then move on. And I'm really excited to talk to you. And the reason I'm excited to talk to you is because you're very fascinating to me for a number of reasons. You've worked in network news. You've worked in an area. Uh, I've read about you a little bit. I've heard some of the things that you've done, uh, particularly in Europe and working for ABC and NBC. So I definitely have a lot of questions about that. And then Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives is by far my favorite food show of all time. Like when I go traveling. What's that?
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, when I go travel,
I left after the 11th season, so I have no idea what it's like now.
Well, I'll tell you what. When I go traveling now, if I'm in a new city, I watch YouTube videos of Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives to decide where I'm going to eat. I ate my way through Hawaii, LA, San Francisco multiple times. I saw that you guys did the squeeze in here where I'm from in Sacramento, which is one of my
I was physically present for that shoot, so it must have been the first year because I didn't go on the road after the first season.
Oh.
And they were, my understanding is they were in the middle of an ADA issue and they actually had to move. Is that correct?
They did. So
we shot at the old place.
Yeah, that place was so much fun. I went to the old place. So it's just this little place that had like 6 stools, people out the back, and
well, I learned a cooking technique there, which is melting cheese on top of something by throwing ice cubes into the pan and then putting a dome on it.
Yeah.
So that the steam from the ice is what softens the cheese. I do that with all sorts of things all the time now.
Yeah, the cheese skirt's famous. Yeah, I take my boys there, and that's the end of the day. Once we eat it, we have to take a nap.
They have some sort of special big deal drink too.
I don't know about it.
A milkshake. I don't know. It's been a while.
Everything they do is gigantic. I mean, the burgers are huge. The tacos are great. It's all just full of grease. And the cool thing is they took the entrance of the old place and they moved it to the new place. Yeah, so you can actually sit within it if you choose. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, talking about you first, I want to get a little bit about your background. Where were you born?
I was born in Queens, New York. And my parents moved to Long Island. Notice I'm a Long Islander in that respect because I called it Long Island. And then decided they wanted to raise their kids outside the New York City bubble. So when I was in 4th grade, we moved to a relatively small town in Massachusetts called Greenfield. My father was the dean of the community college there. And I did my growing up 12 miles south of the point at which New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts come together. It was lovely. Pardon me. Plus, as a teenager, the drinking age was lower in Vermont, and there was no alcohol tax in New Hampshire. So if you wanted to risk your life on the highways, everything was where it ought to be.
Nice. Awesome. So, and growing up, did you always want to be involved in TV or did that come later?
You know, what's funny? I remember driving in from Long Island to see one of our sets of grandparents, and WNEW radio was on, and they were the big middle of the road radio station of their time. And a noted disc jockey, William B. Williams, was on. And I couldn't have been more than, 10 at the time. Maybe, probably 10. And William B. Williams made a joke, and I said to my father, I want to do that. And he said, no, you don't. He looked down on it. But I retained the broadcasting bug. I actually picked my prep school. I was a day student. The school was close to where we lived. I picked my prep school, unbeknownst to my parents, because it had a carrier current radio station. And that's why I wanted to go there. And then when I was, 14 or 15, as everyone of my generation in radio and then TV did, I got my weekend job at the little local radio station in town, where mom and dad had to drive me to and from work. And then it went from there. I followed jobs across the country, did not pay a lot of attention to college, which there's some things I could have learned in college that I didn't, but I ended up chasing radio jobs across Oklahoma and then into Kansas. And in Kansas, in Wichita, I made the switch to television, became a reporter on a local radio station there, and really looked resplendent in my light blue polyester leisure suit with red counter stitching as I did my stand-ups. But don't worry, I had silver platform shoes to match. But then I followed some more jobs. I focused in on investigative reporting.
What drove you to that?
Woodward and Bernstein. I was of the right age, and Watergate had become the thing, and that's what I decided I wanted to do for no good reason other than when I started doing it, I loved it. So I did that at a TV station in Phoenix, and then a TV station in Atlanta, and then a TV station in Houston. And along the way, I had done some freelance producing for NBC, and an opportunity came up, and I was hired to become a producer out of the Chicago Bureau, which I did for a couple of years. Then they sent me to Europe, and I lived in London, and then I lived in Frankfurt, and then I lived in Budapest, covering Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And it was the perfect time to be there. In fact, the reason I was sent to Budapest was to prepare for the obviously upcoming collapse of communism. So I got to cover all of the revolutions, some more serious than others. And I walked through the Berlin Wall the night it opened. I mean, it was a remarkable opportunity. Then I came back to the States and show produced.
So that's amazing. You know, I'm a big Rocky fan, so I wonder how many people give Sylvester Stallone credit for knocking out Ivan Drago and causing that wall to fall. You know?
Yes, well, it was well, to some extent, I'm the reason you saw it. I ran up to the wall as things were going nutty that night with a huge ladder so that my crew could get up to the top of the wall and shoot down. The ladder was immediately wrestled from my grasp once they were up by a bunch of happy Germans who all climbed up to the top of the wall and were dancing around. So I'm the reason you saw those Germans dancing around.
Man, that's amazing. So I mean, you had to know at the time as that was happening that you're literally standing in the middle of history.
You don't think about that when it happens. I mean, you got a job to do. You got time codes to write down as your cameraman is shooting important stuff that you're going to have to cut on deadline. You do your job.
Mm. When you look back and you reflect on that, though, do you think, wow, I mean, is it kind of euphoric a little bit to think that you were part of history?
Look, I was very lucky. I got, more than the Berlin Wall to some extent was running our coverage in Bucharest of the Romanian Revolution.
Yeah,
because that was an ongoing story, and it involved actual bang. And it was, that to me felt far more epical because of the overthrow of Ceausescu. And I had been one of the few journalists allowed into Romania less than a year earlier. They were trying to open up to the West. At that time, they were one of the three most closed countries in the world, along with North Korea and Albania. And they were trying to get some positive Western coverage because they thought it was time to be less cloistered. So they invited some journalists in for their annual party conference and put on a big dog and pony show and, took us around and showed us stuff. And boasted that the big street in Bucharest was a foot or something wider than the Champs-Élysées. I mean, it was a very weird time. But I had already been in that country and seen that it was truly screwed up. I mean, everybody was an informant on everybody just to get enough food or money to stay alive. And covering that revolution was that was a big deal. That was a big deal.
Sounds like it. Now, I also think I read a little bit about you before you came on, and you suggested that you were actually working before the wall fell, kind of behind the Iron Curtain on the other side,
Oh, I'd
right?
been doing that a lot, sure.
Yeah.
We routinely worked in East Berlin. We routinely worked in, the Soviet Union at the time, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, as the country was then called before it split up. It was a good place to work because of the beer. Budweiser, Budovici, or Pilsner Urquell in your little refrigerator in your hotel room. Yeah, I'd spent a fair amount of time on the other side of the wall, which I describe in terms of Berlin. Getting there was like a Smiley movie with the mirror under the car and them pulling out the back seat to make sure no one was being smuggled. Less on the way in than on the way out.
Sure.
But my description of East Berlin was, as you remember in The Wizard of Oz, when it colorizes, when it goes from black and white to color. Well, this is the reverse, because it is the same city. They just put a wall through the middle of it. And as you drive in those days, it's as if all the color was drained out and everything went to black and white.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. So has that, there's a lot of people politically who, believe that the left has kind of gotten it too progressive. Some would say socialist, some would say communist. These are coming from people I know who, are very right wing. You've actually lived and seen what communism actually be, what socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, but I've also seen social democracies. I spent a lot of time in Sweden. Frankly, I lived in Germany, which to some extent is a social democracy. There's a huge difference. And the people who are claiming that we're somehow becoming communist or socialist are full of shit. I am, let me put my cards on the table. I'm a left winger. I'm a huge fan of the social safety net that is social democracy. That is, I'll give you more of my taxes if you give me something in return, like making sure we don't have homeless on the streets in Texas, like or San Francisco. That's not. I have other arguments with the left, which I think has gone nuts in some respect. I think the left, incredibly, to a great extent, much of the left is now opposed to things like free speech. You as an ex-journalist, free speech means the right to espouse the most abhorrent speech. Free speech is on or off. It's not, well, I didn't like that. And, someone should take the word triggering and shove it somewhere. As far as I'm concerned, as an American who believes deeply in democracy and skews to the left side of the fence, you got to let people say anything up until the point that the Supreme Court has defined where they're yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Sure. And people seem to forget that the ACLU got its name and got its recognition by defending Nazis being able to hold.
Oh, the Nazis in Skokie is the perfect test case.
Sure.
You have a town, this was, I think, the 70s. You have a town filled with Holocaust survivors. A neo-Nazi group wants a march there. There is an attempt to stop them, and the ACLU defends them and wins the case, and they have the right to march. But something terrible has happened to the ACLU these days. I mean, this has been written up in a number of places. They're starting to choose cases based only on whether or not they agree with the beliefs of the people they would be defending. And I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Personally.
Yeah. I think that some people tend to forget that free speech, the idea is that you're all there, you all can have the conversation, and the best speech wins. And so
sometimes it doesn't, because life ain't fair.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is, I'm a free speech absolutist. You either have it or you don't. And I say that as a Jew who feels extremely increasingly threatened by the overt nature of the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States. But if you want to say anti-Semitic things, that's your right.
Mhm. Where do you think this political gridlock? I mean, you're a journalist, so you've seen this in other places. Where do you think it's come from?
I've never seen anything like this.
Hmm.
It's come from the fact that much of America is not exceptional. Much of America is ill-informed, undereducated, and in some respects, probably stupid. Otherwise, how could we have gotten to this point? I am deeply distressed with the state of the country. I am distressed for my 30-year-old daughter. I mean, I'm 68. I don't have that much, assuming I make it to 100, it's still not that far.
Right.
I just think, look, when I was hiring producers, I looked for only two things, and it didn't involve television skills because you can learn those on the job. I looked for intelligence and curiosity. And much of America is exhibiting neither.
Yeah.
We have a close family friend who says the most outrageous things, and then I say, where'd you get that? And oh, it's the truth. I saw it. No, you can't. There's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think that a lot of the problem has been, and part of the reason why I started this podcast was because I think that there are a lot of people out there who they listen to respond rather than to listen to understand. And so
they don't listen. They simply let you talk for a while until they can talk over you.
Yeah.
But look, I sound relatively negative. It's because I am deep. I've lived in a lot of places. I've been a lot of places run by autocrats. I'm very scared about what's happening to our country.
What do you think? What is it that you're scared of? Is it that they might come into becoming similar to a country you've been, or something different?
Yeah, I'm scared that the basic rights we consider basic. How's that for repetitive? Basic rights are going to go away one by one if we're not careful. There's a tremendous assault on free speech. At the same time, there's a growing group of people who think armed insurrection is okay if it's for your team. I worry about the loss of religious liberty. That's become a BS talking point among the right. But if anybody's going to get religiously oppressed, it's not the mainstream Christian denominations in the United States. There's too much hate. And frankly, there's very little belief that we should work together to make things better. I mean, Congress is going to be a deadlock for 2 years, which, okay, at least they can't do damage. But no, the bedrock principles that our country has been founded on, liberties, such as, and look, not to get too political, the Supreme Court at this point is clearly a politicized body that is going to twist its findings in virtually every case to meet its political interests. The members of the Supreme Court are originalists until they're not. When they want to say no to something, they're originalists. When they want to say yes to something, even if it makes new law, then that's okay. So no, having lived in a number of countries, having worked in a tremendously large number of countries, I am distressed by the degree to which much of America's population is oblivious to reality and oblivious to the lies that they've embraced.
Now, comparing this to some of the other places you've been, I mean, like you said, you were in Berlin, you've been there during the Romanian Revolution. Do you find that most people in most places are very similar in that way?
You're asking me to go back 30 or 40 years and ask questions I can ask. So it's impossible to answer.
I guess what I wonder is that I just feel like, there's all this stuff we hear about things like, in Russia, or we hear things about communism, we hear things about North Korea, we hear about these things. And I wonder, just the rank and file people, I bet in all of those places, most people are very concerned about the same things that we're concerned about here.
Well,
Getting to work.
people are concerned about the same things everywhere, which is having enough to eat, a decent place to live, and health and happiness for their families. What they're willing to do to get there, or what they demand of their governments to get there, differs in different countries. I mean, I'm going to say something that is going to sound terrible, but Russians, for the most part, over the past, let's see, 45 to 60, 70 years, kind of got the government they wanted in a strange way, because I found a tremendous lack of interest in much of the Russian workforce in working. And they enjoyed bitching about the government, but having a guaranteed salary. That helped allow them to be dominated, because they were willing to be subservient in exchange for just enough to get by. There are different demands and needs in different countries. Frankly, I think the European democracy model, where more is provided to take care of people as a fundamental right, that appeals to me.
So what countries would you say we could implement here? Like what country system? And also, do you think it could scale? Do you think it could?
Look, it's all about what people want, what they are. Americans are not going to live in a communal apartment, as many upper middle class people are willing to do in Sweden. It's just not going to happen. So it's not as if we could implement something. I'd love to see an end to conversations about doing away with things like Medicare, into which people pay anyway. But there's a mean streak in America, especially among the right wing, that wants to hurt people, that just thinks, hey, I got it, you don't, screw you. It's not pleasant. But again, those are my politics. They're to the left of center.
Yeah, I have friends on both sides. I tend to be moderate, though I'd say it's funny, I'm moderate, so nobody likes me, right? All my right-wing friends think I'm a liberal. All my liberal friends think I'm too conservative. But what I've noticed about my conservative friends is it's not so much that they want to hurt people, it's that a lot of them have worked very hard to get where they're at, and they feel like, whether they're right or not, they feel like they've went through a lot to get there, and they feel if they can do it, anyone can. I do agree, though, that sometimes those people do not have a good sense of being able to place themselves into the shoes of someone less fortunate, or say a minority, or a different gender, or someone dealing with a different issue.
How many generations after how many generations do they get to forget that their ancestors were immigrants and tell us how awful immigrants are?
Oh no, I agree with you.
I mean,
I agree with you there. See, that's the thing that I think is what I'm saying, is that they know their story, and then what they'll do a lot of the times, and I think the left do this too to some extent, is they look at their story and they're the hero of their own story, and so therefore they believe everyone can be the hero of their own story, and if we just stopped coddling them, somehow they would get where they're at, and they forget that they do have some things. Like, I do believe that, yeah, there is a privilege to being a white male. It doesn't mean that if you're a white male, like I've had a colorful life. I didn't grow up in like a upper middle class, pay for college, do all those things life. But I do recognize that being 6'7" white guy has definitely helped me a lot more than if I were somebody else, right?
You're 6'7"?
I am. I'm 6'7", played basketball.
Can you help me get that pan off the top shelf?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so all of those things I understand. And I think that sometimes people don't understand that someone like my experience, let's put it this way, my experience, I've been pulled over with a group of white guys and a group of black guys, and the experience is much different.
Of course.
And I don't think enough people have been in that situation to understand that the experience is quite different.
Absolutely.
And so
absolutely.
Now you got to cover a lot of stuff. I mean, like I said, I mean, one of the things I noticed that I really wanted to ask you about it was you had an opportunity to interview Gaddafi in his Tripoli house after it was bombed. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yes.
And tell me what that was like for you. I mean, this guy's a dictator, or at least that's what.
He's a murderer too. Yeah. Having dealt with him previously, it was no surprise to me one-on-one. Pardon me. That he was ungodly charismatic. All leaders, including evil. I mean, I guess Hitler was charismatic. He attracted a crowd. Gaddafi was charismatic. He was well prepared in dealing with the foreign press. He'd been doing it for years. They had their point they wanted to make. They wanted to show me the damage to the house. So I got a little tour, which included the round bed that looked like Hugh Hefner owned it, that had like blue velveteen arms coming out of it with buttons that I assume were for the lights or the stereo. The problem is you don't get an interview like that. Doesn't get you much. Yes, you talk to them, and the bosses in New York can say it's exclusive, but these guys don't tell you much. I mean, at the end of he spoke perfect English. He certainly understood perfect English, but from time to time, for political reasons, when being interviewed, he would insist on Arabic and use a translator. And at the end of the substantive questions, I threw in one more. Not to disparage anyone in today's aware conversation about non-binary, but the New York Post had put on its cover a mocked up picture of Gaddafi wearing a dress and heels because the CIA had leaked them a story, who knows if it was true, that he liked to cross-dress. Is that term still usable? He liked to dress up in women's clothing, and that he was taking a lot of psychotropic drugs. So as my last question, I said, the New York Post says that you like to wear women's clothing and that you're taking a lot of drugs. Would you like to comment on that? And I looked over at the translator, who was not going to translate the question. But Gaddafi did speak English, and he burst out laughing. And then he blamed it all on the Zionists. But he did crack up over the question.
That's interesting. How did you feel when there was a pretty graphic YouTube video of his death? I don't know if you ever saw it or read about it.
Yeah, I saw it. Wow. I'm about to say something that if it were put on my tombstone for my epitaph, probably wouldn't thrill me. He deserved to die. He was an evil monster who had done horrible things. And I was not negatively impacted by his own citizens ripping him to death. Does that make me cold? I'm sorry. I maintained, and whenever I do something journalistic today, I maintain an absolute neutrality. But as a human being, I'm Jewish. He was involved in some awful things against Israel and Jews, so screw him. That's my personal opinion. That's
Yeah. You also had an opportunity to have breakfast in the morning with Yasser Arafat.
Yeah, I met Arafat a bunch of times. I mean, again, talk about neutrality as a journalist and its importance. I met both Arafat, and I interviewed George Habash, who is about as cold-blooded an Arab terrorist has ever walked the face of the earth, and whose eyes were the deadest eyes I've ever seen in my life. But
Wow.
that's what you do when you do it impartially.
Mhm.
And you leave behind any personal feelings you have. Yeah, we had breakfast with Arafat at 3 in the morning because that's, I mean, it wasn't me and him right here. It's a long table with a lot of people
Sure.
at it. But, you do that in the middle of the night before you get the middle of the night interview. And, this was before the State Department had accepted the PLO as a government, and while it was still classified as a terrorist organization. And they refused to acknowledge the existence of Israel. You couldn't say the word in front of them. And those of us who traveled the Middle East all had a second passport to use only for Israel. So, and you'd ask them not to stamp it, but just in case, because if you had an Israeli stamp on your passport, you weren't getting into an Arab country. Anyway, we're having breakfast, and in the middle of the meal, the sound man, and it's always the sound man, perks up and goes, "Blood oranges. I haven't had one of those since I was in Israel."
Wow.
Remember the brokerage firm commercials where the whole room goes dead silent?
Yeah.
Somebody talks, anyway, the room went completely dead silent instantly for what felt like 12 to 15 days. I suspect it was like 3 seconds. And then conversation resumed as if he had never said that, and it was not
Wow.
commented on. I had an interesting situation with Arafat as well. Probably before this, I'm not sure. He was in, where the hell were we? Where does the Blue and White Nile come together? Is that Khartoum? Anyway,
I'm just gonna say yes. I don't know.
No, I hadn't been to this country before. I'd been out jogging in the morning. It was one of those things you take note of. Anyway, there was a big anti-American demonstration that afternoon in the main square, and Arafat was speaking, and it was getting a little rough. And he noted me. I guess this must have been after breakfast because he saw me in the crowd and he gave me a wink, like to say, "It's all for show, relax," which I thought was
interesting, man.
He was a politician. He was a murdering politician, but he was a politician.
Who is your favorite? Who would you say would have been your favorite interview in your time in network news?
Well, I didn't get him. Two different answers here. The most important, most remarkable person on the world stage at the time I was covering, sorry, more coffee. At the time I was covering stuff like this was Mikhail Gorbachev.
Oh, wow.
Who absolutely changed the world, was internally disgraced as a result. But he ended communism. Ronald Reagan did not. I thought he was, of all the people I've seen journalistically, he was the one. Now, the most impressive individual interview was a guy named Yuri Hayek, who had been the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia during the 1968 Russian invasion of the country. He was in New York at the UN at the time and could have stayed, but he flew back to his country because it was his country and he was going to fight for it. By the time I got to know Yuri Hayek in the 80s, he was a dissident and had been for many, many years. He was a member of Charter 77, which was the dissidents group. And every year they picked someone else to be their spokesman, to be surreptitiously interviewed by visiting Western journalists. And then he would be put in prison or something bad would happen to him or his family. And Yuri Hayek, this little man with Coke bottle glasses, sitting in his old, might have been a house, I'm not sure, or apartment. I remember interviewing him and thinking to myself, I don't have balls like that. Here's a guy who knows that this goal of his, that this one interview will not achieve, that what he's doing to get there will cause him personal pain, and he still had the guts to do it. That's pretty damn impressive.
That is, man. Who was the guy that if you could, or gal, if you could get anybody to interview, who would you want to
Today?
interview? Yeah.
There's no one I'm sitting here thinking, man, I mean, there's a lot of people who died I would have liked to have interviewed.
Oh, who's
I'd have
one?
liked to have had a one-on-one with Gorbachev. I would have liked to have had a one-on-one with Einstein. I would like to have had a one-on-one with Golda Meir. You know, I've done a lot of reporting on Israel that at one time got me on their list of assholes because I deeply believe the state of Israel is important and needs to exist. Doesn't mean I have to agree with its government, and doesn't mean that my journalistic pursuits won't expose some things I don't like about what they do. We did a documentary of which I was not in charge, but I was one of the producers of a segment in 1987 called Israel, the 6-Day War plus 20 Years, A Dream is Dying. And we dealt pretty heavily with the fact that being forced into an occupation was ripping at the souls of Israelis.
And so what when you say it was ripping at the soul of Israelis, what do you mean by that?
Being an occupying force requires doing things that seem icky, ties up a tremendous amount of vitality and energy on the part of the populace fighting about it. And unfortunately, look, my view on this is that Arafat had a chance to make peace and blew it. You now have a situation that has led to this ultra right-wing Israeli government led by a prime minister who's under indictment. This is not going to be a good thing. On the other hand, reading one more story about supposed left-wing students at a university getting all hot and bothered about Israel and its territory, I thought to myself, why don't they get hot and bothered about the half of Mexico we took away from them in 1840 something? Or the entire continent that we stole from Native Americans upon whom we then foisted a genocide, or Strasbourg, France, which was once Germany. Should they give that back? I mean, there's a point in history where things that were decided by conflict are a fait accompli, unless you're Israel, and then the world beats you up because it's fun.
Right. Well, what do you think is your favorite place that you were able to, I guess, perform the news?
Anywhere along the coast of Spain.
Oh,
Spain's
really?
my favorite European country. My wife and I just visited a couple of years ago. It's an extraordinary country. It's an extraordinary cuisine. It's amazing weather. Most Americans don't know it exists. So yeah, you put me down. Not Marbella, which is a tourist trap, but any place else, Valencia, just someplace on the water in Spain. I'm a happy guy.
One real quick, we're going to go into food and talk about some of the things you've done since leaving Network News. But I read somewhere that you said that you left Network News with your wife, who I know also worked for NBC, and you said that Network News was no longer what you viewed it as. What did you mean by that?
Well, the network news that I fell in love with was, among other things, not beholden to make a profit. At the time I entered the network news business, the news divisions were loss leaders. Nobody gave a damn about what they made. When all three networks were bought up by conglomerates, that changed, and the way in which we covered the news changed, and grabbing viewers became far more important. And the amount of time available to spend, I mean, I once went to Ethiopia for, I don't know, a week, 10 days, traveling all over the country with a crew and correspondent, just trying to figure out what story was there 1 year after the famine. So we spent anywhere between $60,000 and $100,000 on that story, and then turned out a pretty damn good 4-minute story for nightly news. No one is spending money like that today. Secondarily, I was line producer at Morning America. That means subject to the EP. 1 week out of 3, it was my show. And the EP came to me and said, they're going to have $1 million winner on The Millionaire tonight. That was when it was still hot. You need to put him in the first half hour tomorrow. Now, the first half hour is news. The Millionaire is not news. At that point, I realized that definitions had changed. Let me make one thing perfectly clear, however, he said, doing his best Richard Nixon. I do not believe that major network news is skewed on purpose, or it does bad things on purpose. I still think all 3 networks, well, 4, include CNN, I won't include Fox, that the intent is to tell the truth as best they can. Partially because of financial reasons, partially because they're more interested in attracting viewers than before. There's a much higher level of ineptitude now, and a lot of stupid stuff gets on the air. I throw shoes at the screen every night just for grammatical reasons. So no, it's not the network news that I enjoyed being part of, but they're not the monsters, they're not evil, they're not trying to skew an agenda.
But do you think that it ultimately is?
That what ultimately is?
That it ultimately is skewing an agenda, even if it's not on purpose?
No, well, MS skews an agenda because they're pretty clear that that's what they want. Fox skews an agenda because it's pretty clear that's what they want. I think CNN's a funny one because under Zucker, I do think they had moved to a pretty partisan left-wing position. I think Chris Licht, who was once my intern, is trying to bring them back to the center. But I think the 3 main news operations, CBS, NBC, and ABC, are trying hard not to present an agenda. I mean, look, one of the problems with journalism is that if you're a journalist, you are interested in rooting out, presumably. Well, there's a whole new generation that's just interested in being on television. But if your interest is journalistic, you're looking to root out problems, which means by definition, you're going to be somewhat antagonistic with any power center. And that can get presented as left-wing. I don't think it is.
Well, this is my view on it, and I could be wrong. I'm not a journalist. It's just my observation. I do have a degree in government, which is political science, technically. What I think what's happened here, I agree with you a little bit, and I don't know if I would say that they're not skewing it on purpose. I don't think they're skewing it strictly because of political reasons. Like, I don't think that there's someone there who's just part of the left-wing agenda at MSNBC going, we're going to make sure that we just propagandize everybody to the left. And I don't think there's somebody maybe there is somebody at Fox News going, we're going to skew all this to the right. I think what happened was Fox News figured out that if they do that, they're going to get a lot of viewers. And then all of a sudden, MSNBC and CNN said, well, they've cornered the market on that.
But you're talking about cable, which is not the big 3 news operations that
okay. So you're talking about the network.
I'm talking about broadcast, ABC, CBS, NBC. Yeah. Cable's a different world, and it's the Wild West. And I hope CNN comes back to its objectivity. But no, I'm not going to argue with you that MSNBC isn't left wing. Yeah. Fox is certainly right wing.
Oh no, I agree. And people who sit there and say that it's not, I think that they're just being disingenuous. I mean, it really is. As far as the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, I think you're probably right in that way, that they're legitimate.
Which doesn't mean that they don't accidentally do a lot of stupid shit.
Oh yeah, sure. So
Oh, and the one place that I do think bias crept through recently was in the failure of any network to do, after the Supreme Court killed Roe versus Wade, nobody gave anti-abortion activists a reasonable piece of time to revel in their success. I think this was such an emotional item for so many people, myself included, that I think the network newscasts probably unintentionally went with the "isn't this a shame?" and the folks who got rid of it are evil. Whereas there was a very look, I'm so pro-abortion rights, I can't quantify it, but I do think that somebody should have done a piece giving the activists who had worked for 50 years to get this change, to give them their due and let them say, we did this, we worked hard for it, we're going to revel in it, we think it's a good thing.
You know, I think, this is my personal opinion on this, I think that when this case came through, I think that everybody focused on the wrong thing. And what I mean by that, I think what I mean by that is, you mentioned how politicized the judiciary has become, and how activist the judiciary has become. And I do believe that as well, whether it skews left, whether it skews right, whether it's in the middle, it is. I mean, in fact, I can't remember his name. I think it was Ben Sass, when Justice Kavanaugh was being, before all of the stuff with the sexual assault claims, he said, he goes, you know, I have to apologize to you, Justice Kavanaugh, this should not be that big of a deal. And he's like, but the reason it's such a big deal is because the Congress does not pass specific laws. They do things that are vague. Then policymakers come in and do the interpretation, and then we leave you the job of interpreting this in a way.
No, what the court has clearly said to the congressional branch is, if you want something to happen, pass the damn law. And part of me says that's great.
Yeah.
Part of me says 3 members of that court took an oath to tell the truth and then lied about their position on Roe versus Wade.
Did they say? Well,
they lied. They said it's the phrase was, it's decided law. Now, you want to talk about nuance and implication? Fine.
Yeah, you're talking.
They made it very clear that they weren't going to screw with Roe versus Wade, and then they did. Now, by the way, you know, Roe versus Wade has had problems from the beginning.
Yeah.
Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said she was not thrilled with the basis on which it was initially decided.
Sure.
I mean, that court kind of created a right of privacy. On the other hand, after 50 years as the law of the land, you don't go in and just throw it out.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Like I said, as an attorney, this is something that for me has been, I've had a lot of discussions about this, because you're right. Roe v. Wade, it was very loose. The judicial reasoning, the logical reasoning based on the law was pretty loose. Like coming up with a due process argument that was almost certainly not intended by the 14th Amendment when it was created was quite it was a novel approach that I don't think had a strong basis in law. That doesn't mean that I don't agree that there should be some sort of right to an abortion. I'm just saying that, you know, legally it was pretty loose. And
well, there was another element of Roe v. Wade that nobody has talked about. I addressed it in a documentary I did with Maria Shriver many years ago. Viability. You know, Roe v. Wade uses the viability standard as the cutoff.
Right.
Well, the advances in medical technology are moving viability earlier and earlier.
Yeah.
And that was going to be an issue at some point in the future anyway.
Oh, sure.
That as it may.
Sure, but the thing that is that my whole issue is I go, okay, so when you give the judiciary a right to create a law, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily out of thin air, but pretty close, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you also have the right that then someone can take it away. And that's why,
Mm-hmm.
I tell people when they get upset about that, I say, the best way to do that is to get your base out, get the people into Congress and pass a constitutional amendment that grants a right to an abortion.
You don't
Will
need
that happen?
you don't need a constitutional amendment. You just need a law.
Well, right, but I'm just saying the best way
You're
to
not
make
going to
sure.
look. You can't pass constitutional amendments in modern America. You're just not going to get the support in legislatures.
Yeah, it's tough. It would be
The
tough.
only way to do this is to pass a law that says it's legal, and which, from what I've read, and I'm not a lawyer, but I married one. From what I've read, that's enough.
Yeah, it could
And
be,
it's
but with this,
also that's where the court has been telling Congress to go about everything.
yeah.
Um,
Well, what's interesting about that though is that I don't know with the way that this because this essentially, a lot of people don't understand that this did not say abortion is illegal. It just let the states decide
left it to
where.
the states, right?
So now I wonder if you passed a federal law, that would almost
Mhm.
certainly end up back in the Supreme Court because then the federal law would say, well, this is a states' right issues. That'd be the argument. The other thing that I think people don't think about, some do, but I don't think people think about is I've heard some people say, well, now I'm worried about Oberfeld, which is the one that came out of California that legalized gay marriage throughout the country. And I said, you should be. You should be.
Yeah, you should worry about loving as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because you should be afraid because there is even less precedent and less legal binding for Kennedy's decision there than there was for Roe v. Wade. Not to say that it shouldn't be legal; it certainly should be
Except,
legal.
you know what? It all makes sense. Those are things in a modern society that should be accepted, which gets to a much broader question about conservatives in the court. They want to be originalists. Okay, under the original, what the founders decreed was that black people would be counted as 3/5 of white people.
Oh yeah.
Women could not vote. Only landowners could vote. So this is horseshit.
Yeah.
The concept, this was always intended. If you look at intent, I believe the Constitution was intended to be a living document. I believe that the founders, who were revolutionaries, did not want to handcuff us into the beliefs of their day. And I believe that the right wing on this court uses that specious argument to pursue its own agenda. I mean, this is not, the founders didn't really consider whether or not it was legal to impose speed limits on cars that went 65 miles an hour. They had no concept of internet privacy. Frankly, they had no concept of HIPAA. And any other medical issue. So I think it's a red herring to try to declare that the Constitution, as it would have been interpreted by a bunch of dead guys, is how we should be living our lives in the 21st century.
Well, if you read some of Thomas Jefferson's writings, you see there were times where he espoused an idea that every generation should create its own constitution. So that does certainly lead to the idea that he did expect that the Constitution would change over time. I think some of the framers would be, if they were here today, would be surprised that we haven't created anything different. And have said, and I think they would look at our system and go, this is not what we were intending.
No, I mean, look, who was it? Was it Franklin asked, what have you given us? Was it Franklin or Jefferson who said, a republic if you can keep it?
Yeah, right.
Or did he say democracy? We're not a democracy, we're a republic. But anyway.
Wow.
Well, but I have no strong feelings on any of this.
Yeah, I can tell. Well, and it's good to hear from somebody who's been a journalist, who's been around, who's actually seen these things. A lot of people have opinions who've never been there. You have. Now transferring this back, so you get out of network news, you start your own production company.
Mhm.
You're kind of hooked in, and I understand that Al Roker is the one who kind of helped you.
Yeah,
Uh,
Al, when I was the co-founder, co-producer of the Weekend Today show,
hmm,
and Al was on that show before he transitioned over to the main show to replace Willard Scott. And when I opened a production company, I basically couldn't get any work.
hmm.
So I called Al, who has a production company, and I said, "You got anything you could throw my way?" And he said, "Sure, I'm doing a lot of stuff for the Food Network. Why don't I subcontract some of it to you?" So he did that. And that's how I became familiar with the Food Network and vice versa. And at some point, he and I both agreed I wasn't going to make any real money as a subcontracted employee. So I started pitching the network myself.
Hmm. And of course, you pitched the idea for diners, drive-ins, and dives. Tell us how that came about.
Well, I had made a number of phone calls pitching stuff to a particular network executive. And she was kind enough to take my calls, but nothing was going anywhere. I mean, she just kept turning stuff down. Finally, on the latest of those calls, which I think was on a late Thursday or late Friday afternoon, I was in my office, in my house, and I had done a documentary for them through Al Roker's company about diners. And finally, in frustration, as she turned down yet another of my pitches, she said, "Don't you have anything else about diners?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm developing this show, Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives." And I told her all about it. And finally, she said, "That sounds good. Give me a write-up. On Monday, we have a development meeting on Tuesday." And I hung up the phone, kind of conflicted. On the one hand, this was good news. On the other hand, I had just made up the name out of thin air on the phone when she asked, and the detailed description of the show that I gave her. So now I had, a weekend to call around the country and try to come up with enough bookings and such to fill a proposal. So I wrote a proposal for a 1 hour special. That's what she asked for. Sent it in. She got it Monday. Shortly thereafter, they commissioned a special, which did far better than they expected, which resulted in something unusual. They had not, to the best of my knowledge, considered this as a series. Guy had won the Food Network Star Contest, the second one. And back then, they actually thought this contest was going to develop their future stars. It turned out he's the only one who ever made it. But they wanted to keep him visible to the public while they developed a primetime show for him. And they had asked a couple of big boy production companies to come up with proposals. But after our special did well, they looked at those big boy proposals and didn't like them. So they kind of took a risk on this little guy who was at that time out in Minneapolis and said, "Why don't you do a short season of Diners for us?" And we did. And within a few episodes, it was clear this was a hit. But they warned me. They said, "Look, this may have a year or two in it, but it's not going to have legs because there just aren't enough restaurants." And
there are plenty of
I left after season 11. They're now in season 40 something. So there might have been enough restaurants.
Yeah. This is America. There's a restaurant everywhere. When I was in Italy one time, and I sat down next to this German couple, and it was really funny. I was actually really surprised, talking about food, how different Europeans look at it, particularly Italians. Because I sat down there, and in sitting down, I spent about 3 hours talking to this German couple. I mean, they just sat there all day, drinking wine, eating great food, and talking. And I remember him saying to me, he goes, "You're from America?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I would love to go to America." And I said, "What do you think you would do if you came to America?" And he goes, "I would eat Whoppers for every meal." And I said, "Are you serious?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Is that what you think of our country?" He goes, "Wasn't that true? Don't you have a fast food restaurant on every corner?" And I said, "No." Right. I mean, I was like 23, 24 at the time.
That is the impression.
Yeah. And so then I fly back. My dad picks us up. We drive back, and I look at it, and I was like, you know what? He's not far off. There
No,
really
he's
is.
not.
Yeah, there's a restaurant
Not.
on every corner. So it doesn't surprise me they've gotten to 40. So now, tell me, what is your so Guy is a relatively unknown when you bring him in.
Hmm.
Was it? Did you know pretty quickly that you really had a pretty good host here?
Well, when they first told me he was going to be the host, I didn't know who he was.
Mm.
So I Googled him and I saw this cartoon. I mean, it was really him, but it looked like a cartoon to me, and I thought, I'm screwed. So then we went out to shoot the pilot, and it was obvious very quickly that he was lightning in a bottle. He didn't know anything about television. He frankly didn't know all that much about diners. He's a California guy, and to him, a diner was just a greasy spoon serving hamburgers. But he had more natural talent for television than anyone else I've met. And B, he picked this stuff up very quickly. And C, at the time, he was coachable. I could teach him, and this sounds arrogant, I don't mean it to, but I could teach him how to do TV the right way. And very quickly, it was clear that he was going to work.
Yeah, he seems, every time he goes in, I have watched a ton of Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. It is not great for my diet, but whenever he goes in there, it seems like he becomes buddies with people just right off the gate.
Yeah, no, he's a very forceful, dynamic, friendly personality. And look, TV is all about one thing: spending time with people you want to spend time with. That's why Tom Selleck's a big star. That's why what's her name? She's great. Now I'll forget her name. The woman who was in Cagney and Lacey. She's been in a million TV shows because you want to hang out with her. It's only about feeling comfortable with the person you're with. If you have that, I can make it great. If you don't, I can't make it good. You have to come through the lens, and Guy's far from the only on-air talent I've coached up, and it's all the same. Either you have it or you don't. If you have it, as green or as rudimentary as you may be, I can go from there. But you got to have it.
So, what were some of the things that you recall having to kind of teach him?
Oh, first of all, let's not place this. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm saying I made Guy Fieri. Okay.
Oh, sure.
Guy's a tremendously talented individual, but some of it, I mean, it's everything from the technical of how to eat something on camera without looking disgusting, to how to interact with someone in a way that is natural but still encompasses the shot that you need, to how to read a script. That's in some respects the most important, because narrating for television is like music. It's all about using the melody of your words to convey your story correctly. But let me be clear. I didn't make Guy. I helped Guy maximize his potential.
Yeah. Wow. Is there, tell us a little bit about the process of picking the restaurants for Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives.
Well, again, I don't know what they do today. When I was running things, we had researchers. We would tell them what area we want to go to, because again, so much of television is budget. I would choose geographical areas such as the Four Corners of Colorado, Arizona, et cetera, that would allow us in the course of 5 shooting days to stockpile locations from various states or regions, so that when we put these segments together into full shows, we had variety. We would begin, the internet was not as significant then as it is now, though it was significant. The researchers would do a complete search of all food-related publications or stories in a particular area, try to figure out who those knowledgeable about food in the area were, who's writing a column, who's a food critic, who knows somebody, call them and talk and ask for suggestions. And then we would narrow those down by doing extensive interviews with the owners or chefs at any of those places, in an attempt to figure out if they were really doing homemade food the way we thought it ought to be done. We were very good at picking. Only 5% of the time that we showed up at a place to shoot did I get a call from guys saying, And at that point, I would say, well, thank them politely and walk out. And the network thought I was crazy because I didn't tell them about this. I ate this cash, but I just wasn't going to put something on the air that shouldn't be on the air.
No, that makes sense. And so what were some of your favorite cities to go to for
Well, I didn't, after the first season, well, maybe part of the second season because we did a diner tour, but I mostly was controlling the operation from back in the office at that point, and I had crews and producers going out with Guy. But I enjoyed going to the Squeeze Inn. I enjoyed our New Jersey diner tour. I loved the barbecue joint a mutton barbecue joint we did in Lexington, Kentucky, which I didn't shoot at originally, but my daughter's an equestrian, and we often competed when she was in high school in Lexington. So I got to spend a fair amount of time eating mutton barbecue at that place. It got to the point where I couldn't go in that often because they would fill our table with food and they wouldn't take any money. And it turned out they, like many other places, being on diners had actually saved them from bankruptcy.
I've actually heard of that a couple of times. I know that with the Squeeze In, after it aired, that was a big deal.
Yeah, it gets a little busy.
Yeah, it does. What is your favorite kind of food?
Overall, I'd probably say Spanish, although my two favorite dishes, my death row dishes, depending upon how I feel on a given day, would either be bagels, lox, and cream cheese, or Central Texas brisket from Louis Miller's.
Oh, big brisket fan, huh?
Central Texas barbecue fan, yes.
Oh, yeah, you are. Okay. All right. Yeah. So now you did 11 seasons with Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. Did something change? Why did you eventually leave?
It's television. Things happen.
Okay. So we'll keep it tight-lipped as to the reason there why you took off. Yeah, sure. So since Triple D, well, do you still keep in contact with anybody, Guy or anybody else that was involved?
No, television, unfortunately, is a very tight-knit business while you're doing it, and then everyone moves on to something else.
Okay.
I moved on to a series about craft beer called Beer Geeks with a terrific talent named Michael Ferguson, who's a well-known member of the brewing community. Then I moved on to my book, and now I'm pretty much full-time focused on a radio show I'm syndicating called Martini Music, which is all about the music of the 30s and 40s.
Oh, nice. Wow.
Yeah.
So on your radio show, do you just play the music or do you give a little history of the music first?
Oh, I tell you, each episode features either a performer or a genre or a composer. And the whole idea is that by the time the hour is done, you know a whole lot more than you ever knew before about the individual songs or the individuals I'm featuring.
Now, are you into that music specifically, or why?
Yeah, I happen to love that music, but I also happen to love the rock and roll of the late 60s, either of which would have made a syndicated show, but the syndicators suggested that it was probably better to go with the old stuff. So
interesting. So when you say the late 60s rock, what are the bands you're talking about?
Chicago,
Mm.
Carly Simon, James Taylor, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the Beatles, the Stones, Bread, that genre.
Mm.
I was a teenage DJ.
I
I
saw
remember when the album American Pie showed up.
I saw Chicago with Crosby,
Elton
Stills.
John, by the way. Yes, you saw Chicago where?
I did here in Sacramento at the Cal Expo. They don't
Yeah,
do concerts really
is
anymore.
Peter Cetera still with it?
He was then. This is back probably in 1998, so it's been a while. First of all, I was surprised because everybody was there. Chicago was the headliner, but Crosby, Stills, and Nash came out, and I was expecting. I watched Woodstock, the documentary, so that's where I learned of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Well, they're among my favorites from that era.
Oh, okay, great. And so I was expecting to be quite folky. No, they came out and they clearly wanted to rock, and they did. It blew me away. I became bigger fans. They were a band. I love it when you go to a band live and it makes you a bigger fan or turns you into.
Yeah, and that's hard to find because so much of what goes on at the hands of the producer and engineer.
Yeah,
in the recording studio. Pardon me. But no, look, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Billy Joel, Elton John, Carole King. It's much to my disappointment, we went to see Dylan recently.
Oh, really?
He's arguably still alive. He doesn't say a word to the crowd. He doesn't get out from behind his piano. He doesn't play his guitar, and he mostly talks the songs. So, okay.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I took my dad, his favorite band is The Who, and I fell in love with them young. My dad actually got the pay-per-view. It was 1989, and The Who did the rock opera Tommy, put it on pay-per-view. It was the last time they were going to do it. They did it in LA, and we had a recording of that, and I watched that all through my high school. And so I took him to see The Who, which now is just Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend. And this had to have been 2000 and probably like 2006. And man, like we went and saw them, and they had just at that point, they seemed a little too old to hit, Roger Daltrey couldn't hit those loud screens anymore.
I don't want to see that. I want to see, who was it? I guess it was James Taylor and Carole King did a back-to-back where they each did a set, and then they came to. We saw that recently. It was phenomenal.
Yeah.
When I was line producing GMA, we were doing concerts in the park, and we did one with Carly Simon, who is notorious for stage fright, and we recorded it to play it back the next day. Her people insisted they wanted to auto-tune it if she was off key. Anyway, she's walking back from the stage, and I'm coming out of the control room trailer, and I say to her, Miss Simon, that was absolutely fantastic. And she looks at me, she goes, well, I'm glad someone thinks so.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that old music. I mean, the older music, I was born in the 80s, but man, something about the 60s that's just magical, for music.
Yeah, well, look, the 60s basically at this point are great music and a bucket full of dashed hopes.
Yeah. It's funny. I wonder if my son he plays guitar. He's he sings. He wants to be a rock star. He's in a choir. I mean, he's very talented. And so I make a point, all my kids, I got 4, and all of my kids and I make them listen to 80s music and some 90s, but mainly 80s. And I took him, I've taken him to some of those old bands, and then some of the 90s ones too. We just recently saw Green Day and Weezer and Fall Out Boy, and it's cool to watch your kids fall in love with the music that you fell in love with.
Yeah, but you know what? If he's a guitar player, play him some Django Reinhardt.
Oh yeah, he's getting into all of that stuff. I mean,
play him some Django Reinhardt. Play him some of the old stuff. Come on, get in there.
I will definitely. Well, so you have a book, Food Americana. I picked up a copy.
Buy it. I had to put my daughter through grad school, for God's sake.
What is she trying to get a graduate degree in?
My daughter went straight through at Columbia, got her MFA in poetry.
Wow.
We can't figure out how to open a poetry store. So she is vice president for online marketing at a company that sells crystals and precious gems while she writes poetry at home.
Nice.
Some of which will soon be published, I suspect, because she's really good.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, your book, Food Americana. So
Yes.
picked it up, started reading it. I've only gotten through a couple of chapters, read your chapter on pizza. It made me hungry immediately. Tell us about
Good.
your book.
Well, when I was first sent to Europe, I had never contemplated leaving the country. They called me up one day and said, "You want to move to England?" So I found myself woefully unprepared when I started traveling Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. I was going to country after country that I basically knew nothing about. And as I tried to catch up, I pretty quickly came to realize that food is a gateway to understanding a culture. That choucroute is the native dish of Strasbourg, France, because they fought over that plot of land for years, and it used to be Germany. Or meze reflects the mindset of the Greek culture that wants conviviality, as Epicurus, and yes, there was an Epicurus, wrote that you should determine who you're going to eat with before you determine what you're going to eat, because eating by yourself is like being a wolf. You know, in Tuscany, for example, they eat a tremendous amount of wild boar. Well, the reason they do that is it's historically been a tremendously poor region, and if you couldn't shoot it, you weren't going to eat. I brought those feelings back to the States with me when I moved back, and they underpinned some of what I was looking for in diners. And then after diners, after Beer Geeks, I was looking for a new project. And I said to myself, what is American cuisine? Much as that encounter you had in Italy with people who thought American cuisine was nothing but burgers. Other countries have cuisines, although to be fair, other regions have cuisines. There's you know, most other countries, they don't have a national cuisine. They have a series of regional cuisines. The food in Venice and the food in Naples are very different. Having said that, I decided to determine what is American cuisine, he said grammatically incorrectly. And after a couple of years, I came to the conclusion that, to use the old melting pot trope, which is to a great extent true, America built a cuisine out of the foods of a variety of other cuisines that came with people as they emigrated to this country. When they came here, be it from Italy or Romania or wherever, or Mexico, they then created an Americanized version of that cuisine down through the years. And no, Mexican-American food is not Mexican food. It doesn't make it any less valuable or any less worthwhile. It's just an evolved cuisine of its own, based on what Americans would eat of what was initially a Mexican menu, of available ingredients to make a Mexican menu out of. When the poorest of the poor came here from southern Italy, they were stunned at the abundance of food available even to those who were poor, which is why pizza, that had at one point been nothing more than dough and tomato, suddenly became this thing with so much stuff on it, which is why meat sauce came to be. There was no meat sauce in southern Italy. Good luck getting meat. Here, even if you were poor, you could afford some meat. And that's why Americanized Italian food, to a great extent, involves a sense of abbondanza, of abundance. And I chose the cuisines that had been Americanized enough to form part of our national cuisine based on could you regularly look up at lunchtime and say, let's go get that anywhere in the country? Which is why Chinese is in, sushi is in, Thai is not, Vietnamese is not. I'm just looking at the items that are now everyday American eating, and that includes sushi, by the way.
Yeah. No, I love sushi. It's great. So your book is Food Americana. You can get it virtually anywhere, including Amazon, which is where I got it.
Good. Go to Amazon. And by the way, it makes a great gift. Pick up another 6 or 7 copies.
Yeah, definitely. Question I ask everybody, and this is, I think, good, but you've had a strong career in television, in network news, in Food Network. You've written a book. You're doing a radio show. What would you say in your 68 years would you be your greatest success?
Oh, diners, certainly creating diners. Yeah, no, that at the risk of sounding self-congratulatory, that's pretty much the biggest hit that network ever had. And to some extent, it redefined how you do food TV. So no, that clearly that was my biggest success.
I agree. I don't know anybody who hasn't seen it. I mean, everybody has seen it. Everybody, if you turn on a show, if I have people over and I turn on a show, they all want to watch it. Nobody's bored by it. And and there's always a great meal on it. There have been times I've looked at it and go, I think I could make that. You know what I mean?
You understand, at least when I was doing the show, every step and every ingredient was shown on TV.
Yeah.
It was nothing was glossed over. It was legit.
Yeah. And everywhere I've gone, I got to tell you, everywhere I've gone as a result, some better than others, but I've never had a bad meal. I always go in and I go, okay, whatever they gave Guy, I want to try. Right. And
my experience was that most of the places kept up the standard, that a few cashed in and it wasn't wonderful. But for the most part, most of the places in my day seemed to continue at the standard that we had recorded on TV.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. It was great. As far as the next question, what would be your biggest failure and what did you learn from it?
My biggest failure was probably Beer Geeks. I nearly went broke with it. I cared deeply about it, tried to syndicate it, tried to stream it, couldn't make it profitable. I'm very pleased with the show, but in some respects, I think it might be better than Diners, but couldn't make it viable. So that's a failure.
You mentioned streaming. So over the course of time, how much more difficult is it? Is it more difficult or is it easier now to get a show up and running with all of these different streaming services?
I'm not pitching TV shows anymore, but the fact of the matter is there is a great consolidation underway. And whether it's streaming or cable, there are fewer and fewer big operators controlling everything. So it's harder and harder to get on the air. Now, if you want to go the YouTube route, if you want to self-fund and put your stuff on YouTube and hope that perhaps someone sees it and wants to take it to a lucrative platform, that's a way to go. But Discovery, for example, they bought Scripps, which is food, and HGTV. And they have done away with the industry standard practice. It used to be that if someone took a show from you, they paid the production costs up front. Discovery won't do it. All they do now is set you up with a preferred lender to loan you the money at, I don't know what the interest rate is. It's become harder and harder for the little guy to play in the big sandbox.
Wow. So at some point, everybody passes away. Everybody has, they have a funeral, we hope, and someone gives a eulogy. What's the one thing that you would like to be said in your eulogy?
He tried to be decent.
It's important. I think it's important to add that he tried, because we all have our faults.
We have our moments. We have our ups. We have our downs. I'm very proud of the fact that when I had Diners, we would hear from a lot of people who wanted like an autograph or something for a terminally ill child or other relative, I would book those people and send them to a shoot to see Guy. I wouldn't just send them an autograph. So, that's as good as I've tried to be. And I've had my less than good moments.
Sure. Well, we all have, that's another thing that I find really interesting. We had talked, and just to kind of wrap this up, we talked about the left and the right and the free speech issues. One of the things that I'm concerned about often is this concept of people being quote unquote canceled, because I think about some of the things I've done in my life. I think about some of the things that I'm not proud of. Thank God I was going through high school before the internet. I mean,
yeah.
If YouTube were around when I was 15, 16 years old, I would probably have may not have been.
There should be a rule that nothing you did before you were 18 can count against you.
You're right.
Now, when a grown-up Mel Gibson calls a female police officer sugar tits and claims that the Jews run the world, I'm okay not watching his movies.
Sure. Well, yeah. But I'm talking about when they're going back, 10, 15 years ago.
Before 18, let's just assume you were stupid.
Sure.
Okay? And there should be a stupid exemption for everything before the age of 18. It's that simple.
I think my point, I guess, of what I'm trying to say is sometimes I think about if the worst thing I ever said or the worst thing I ever did was posted for the whole world to see.
Oh yeah.
I would hope that people would have a little bit of mercy. And so I try to give that same mercy. Now there are some people out there, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world get exactly what they need. They're exactly what they deserve, but there are some people out there that, they say something bad, they say something wrong, and they deserve to, feel bad about it. But man,
But see, that opens up a whole other conversation that I fear we don't have time for, since, wow, we've been on for a while. How do you separate the artist from the art?
That is,
I mean, Bill Cosby, in my opinion, a disgusting criminal, despite what the appeals court may have said, still is one of the most important comedians in the history of the genre. Do you forget that? Do you ignore it? What do you do?
That is a great question, and that is a conversation that I've had offline many times, because you can't forget all of the things that he did. He had in his show, he had therapists and people on there to assure that not one single negative picture of Black culture was put on his show. I mean, that's a level of care that none to that day at that point had. He was the first person to do a cartoon with the proper proportions for Black.
No, it's and on the other hand,
but he also rapes.
It's like, what's his name? Polanski.
Oh yeah.
Pardon me. Was Rosemary's Baby a lousy movie? No, it's a great movie. Is he a rapist? Yes.
That's so hard. One of my favorite movies of all time is Pulp Fiction, made by Miramax. So it's just
there you go.
And Quentin Tarantino is one of my favorite directors of all time, and Harvey Weinstein was very instrumental in getting Quentin Tarantino where he is today. And it's a tough one, because I love art, I love the movies, I love music, and then man, some of those people are real bad.
Look, Eric Clapton is an extraordinary guitarist. He's also kind of a fascist. If you listen to him, he's a racist. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
It is. Well, listen, Mr. Page, I have really enjoyed talking to you. It's been really fascinating getting to know you. And so is there anything else that you think it's important for us to know about David Page?
Important to know about David Page? I just want to be creative. That's it. Other people say at my age, why don't you retire? Why don't you go fishing? Why don't you play golf? My hobbies have always been the sorts of things I do for work. So there you go.
And you know that old adage: if you work, or if you're doing what you love, you never work a day in your life. Right?
Correct.
So awesome.
Correct.
Well, thank you, Mr. Page, for coming on. If you've made it through the entire hour and a half here, please subscribe, and you know, let's when you get your next project going, as the syndication goes on, let's have you on again. I'd love to talk to you.
I'd love to do. One of the nice things about journalism is you get to meet cool people. So let's stay in touch. Yeah. And thank you very much for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We'll talk to you next time.
Take care.